The prospect of electric vehicles is now very real. Tesla is the market leader in electric vehicles per se, but if you compare its output to the likes of Volkswagen, it pales to an insignificance. This is the Volkswagen share price chart. We've just seen it race to a new record high at over 300 euros per share. Volkswagen has just announced that it's building 6 new gigafactories in Europe by 2030 to supply the electric vehicle market. What's all this mean? And what's it mean for the mining sector? Let's now catch up with our guest, John Meyer from SP Angel. John, welcome. It's good to talk to you again. You issued a note recently just talking about this gigafactory target that Volkswagen has got for its expansion across Europe. Before we get into the detail of it, what is a gigafactory? My understanding is, and I've only ever heard this word come out of the lips of Elon Musk, and my understanding is it really relates to what Musk is doing in Nevada. Can we say then that what Volkswagen is doing is trying to replicate the success that Elon Musk has had?
Absolutely. Volkswagen is not trying to invent anything particularly new here, but what they are doing is saying we can do everything that Tesla is doing, and we're very good. Well, we know that Volkswagen are good engineers. We know they're an enormous automotive manufacturing business, and they are catching up. And so what's driven Volkswagen share prices is they had the Volkswagen Battery Day. Again, they're copying Tesla. Why not? And they're saying we're going to build 6 gigafactories in Europe with 240 gigawatt hours of capacity. And each one of each gigawatt hour of capacity relates to the size of the battery manufacturing that they're putting in place there. So if you think that your average car is probably going to use around 50 megawatts or a 50 megawatt battery pack, and the gigawatt relates to how many battery packs they'll be able to produce, how many cars they can do. So 240 gigawatt hours will give you an idea of the scale of electric vehicle manufacturing that they're going for.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know you're not an auto manufacturer analyst, and I won't drive you, forgive the pun, into that particular corner to discuss that. But I do think it's worth mentioning and picking up a point you said that about the fact that Tesla is the market leader, and it's what Volkswagen is doing is trying to replicate what the success that Tesla has had. Of course, that Volkswagen separately has a massive network of its own in terms of opportunities to sell into. So I guess it's a really big advantage for VW to use that network to then roll out its electric vehicles. But from your point of view as a mining analyst, what does this mean? What does it bring to the opportunity as you see it within the sector?
Well, it's further confirmation of what Volkswagen have been saying. In fact, Volkswagen poached a member of my team a year ago to work on their battery materials procurement. So he's busy running around the world, I assume, because of course he doesn't tell me anything he shouldn't tell me. But he's busy securing the various materials that they require. So we're talking about nickel, graphite, lithium, cobalt, manganese. I'm not sure he's working on all of those, but we have an idea of what they're doing. They've built this big team to make sure they can get the raw materials, the commodities, and to get the purity, because you don't want just any old piece of graphite. You want the right type of spherical graphite that will be made, that will go into the mix for the battery anodes, for example, so that you can make good quality batteries. Definitely not all batteries are made the same. We saw huge recalls in South Korea, for example. And in fact, we noticed there was another announcement from Volkswagen saying that they're moving from SK Innovation and one of the other, I think it was LG Chem, and moving to use Qatar, which is Chinese, for their prismatic batteries. So, for example, this is a prismatic battery, often known as a pouch cell, and Tesla is using these cylindrical cells, or they're moving on to a bigger cylindrical cell for their batteries. And there's different schools of thought in this.
What about the technology itself? Because my understanding is, and again, I reference your note that you issued earlier on in the week, that you say that Volkswagen estimates that battery costs will fall by 50%. Now, Volkswagen, I believe, my understanding is, it's going to implement its own structures here, its own technologies, and ultimately, I guess, find its own ways of doing this in order to manufacture batteries to its own specification. That interesting comment about the drop of the cost of all this. The input costs are not going down. I mean, we've spoken about this before. The increase in the base metals that you just reeled off there, we've seen a big rise in these costs. So the input costs are not falling. So where are they going to get this 50% reduction in overall costs from?
Well, we don't expect the input costs to fall particularly. There's different ways. Firstly, making the batteries more efficiently, and Tesla has talked about driving the cost down to $100 per kilowatt. Secondly, the battery pack. So when you make the batteries, but then you have to bolt them into a pack with heat management, with power management systems, and Tesla has done that brilliantly well. Their battery packs have worked beyond expectation. The cycle lives, the number of years they work for, the power that you get out of them, they have really been very consistent performers. And that's partly because, in fact, a Tesla battery pack is about twice as big as you realize in terms of capacity. So when you're driving your Tesla, you're only really ever using about half of that battery pack. In fact, it's similar for iPhones as well. You never use the full charge in an iPhone because otherwise you'll degrade the battery much faster. So the battery management system stops you from destroying your phone by overusing it. And that's why with an iPhone, you shouldn't really ever charge it beyond 90%, and you shouldn't ever discharge it beyond 20%, for example. And if you drive within those ranges, the battery pack on your Tesla will last much longer. And of course, everybody else is catching up with that. So Volkswagen are working on the system around the batteries, and that's just as important as the actual batteries that go into the pack in the first place.
My understanding as well is that Volkswagen hopes to install something like around about 18,000 public fast charging points in Europe. We're talking here about 6 gigafactories, but 18,000 areas where you can charge a vehicle. And of course, the connectivity with this brings about all sorts of opportunities, I guess, within your sector, your area of miners. What are we talking about here in terms of the miners that will end up having to supply what's needed here to get the connectivity up and running?
Well, clearly there's going to have to be an awful lot of copper to be used in the cabling. You use aluminium for overhead grid networks, for example, but anything that goes into the ground, anything that connects, for example, a wind turbine into the grid, anything that connects the grid to the consumer product, all requires copper cabling. And I was presenting to the technical, the head of technology at a major manufacturer not long ago, and they said to me, well, no matter what calculations you use for how much copper cabling is required within a piece of electrical machinery, you actually need to increase that by quite a lot. So I think lots of people have been working out numbers based on theory, but in practice, the size of the copper cables is going to have to be very much larger than anyone actually expects. And so I think we're going to get a surprise on the upside in terms of demand use. We already know that electric vehicle sales are beating expectations. We already know that Volkswagen, for example, are rolling out a whole lot of new models, and clearly those vehicles will have to be sold, and they will ensure that they get sold one way or another, even though they'll be quite expensive cars. It'll just be cheaper leasing programs and better finance packages for these things, and of course you get the benefit of lower cost motoring because you're not having to put diesel or gasoline in. So actually, in many respects, everyone's a winner. But there's still a lot more. There's certainly a lot of commodity that has to go into these things.
Do you see what Volkswagen is doing, which already replicates what Tesla's done? Do you see what Volkswagen is doing being replicated out amongst the likes of Ford and Toyota and the other big motor manufacturers? Or are they able to use the technology from the likes of VW themselves? What's the future here?
Well, yes, if you remember, Volkswagen were the poster child for Dieselgate. So they really got blamed for, polluting cars. And in fact, I would blame the smaller engines. Small engines don't work very well with diesel. I mean, big engines in lorries work brilliantly well for diesel, and in fact, the pollution that comes out of them is relatively low. But it doesn't work so well for small vehicles. And of course, Volkswagen were caught cheating, as were a number of other German automotive manufacturers. In fact, I don't think anyone was particularly squeaky clean in this. So they went, if you remember, a year ago, or in fact 2 years ago, they declared that they were going to go electric, and everybody saw that as a PR stunt in order to try and deflect attention to do with Dieselgate. Now what we're seeing is it's not just a PR stunt. They are actually really serious about going electric and dropping the whole Dieselgate shambles behind them and becoming the next Tesla. And of course, now their rating is starting to catch up and show, as and replicate some of what Tesla has done.
This itself is a fascinating area, and of course, clearly we're just at the very beginning, I think, of what we're seeing here amongst auto manufacturers around the world. Just one other thing, John, before we wrap this up. Just wanted your thoughts on what's happening with the nickel market. You and I were talking about this a few weeks ago. I spoke to Brad Mills, a specialist in the nickel field. Let's just bring up a chart for nickel. We've seen this big pullback in the price of nickel. Can you give us any indication as to what's happening in the market, any sort of insight as to why we've seen this pullback? Is this just a regrouping before we get to further highs? Because my understanding is that nickel is one of the metals that is so important in the future of building these batteries and the networks and so forth.
Nickel is kind of hard to replace in terms of batteries and fuel cells because it's the only metal that practically can cope with the harsh environment within the battery or the fuel cell, which is either acid or alkaline. Nickel prices have come back to about $16,000 a ton. It's still a very high price for nickel. I think the price will rest here. It's not a huge pullback. It's just a little bit of retracement from long only funds that had gone long of these metals and are now taking a bit of profit. So there's no fundamental damage, I think, to the market. It was quite a finely balanced market where almost all the world's nickel goes into stainless steel for knives and forks, or for handrails for stations and things like that. And the fact that there is now a new big major use and a growing use for nickel in the battery market is going to be a big demand driver, and nobody quite knows where all that nickel is going to come from. And okay, there are a few nickel producers out there that will be able to produce a bit more nickel, but not enough nickel to actually meet all the expected demand. Not enough nickel to account for 240 gigawatts of new battery factories to be developed by Volkswagen. So I was running some numbers yesterday, and if just 10% of the world's vehicle fleet is sold is sold as electric vehicles, that would increase nickel demand by about 14%. Now, in fact, UBS recently said, well, by 2030, they reckon that 40% of the world's fleet will be electric vehicles. So, the projections are looking quite aggressive now, and in fact, we're all wondering where all this metal's going to come from.
The topic for another day, I guess, as well, to talk more about some of the supply for some of these metals. But John, look, thanks indeed for joining us. And if anybody wants to catch up with John's note, I'm sure you can contact John, and he will give you some more details about what we've been talking about today, and that is the gigafactories that have been proposed by Volkswagen. That's John Meyer from SP Angel. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter @IGTV and subscribe to our YouTube channel.